I loved Marvel's Phase 4. After Avengers Endgame, the MCU as we know it had changed, whether it was through the actual content we were getting like TV shows and movies, or just brand new characters and mantles being passed down. There was a lot of change in the MCU, and it was a pretty sudden one, especially with COVID and how all of that affected the future of the MCU. A lot of people believe that Phase 4 is the worst phase of the entire MCU, and I'll be giving you guys my ranking of all 4 phases at the end of the video, so stick around for that. But in this video, I'm going to be going through why I love Marvel's Phase 4 and all of the parts I like as well as dislike and just my overall Phase 4 review. And if you guys didn't know, Black Panther Wakanda Forever was the final movie in Marvel's Phase 4, and that's why I'm reviewing Phase 4 here. Let me know what you guys think of Phase 4 as a whole in the comments down below. And while you're down there, if you guys are new here and you enjoy all my movie and TV show reviews, reactions, and breakdowns, make sure to subscribe button notification on so you don't miss any time of the video or go live. But there's some more time, let's get into it. I want to start off by talking about the TV shows because this is the newest aspect of the MCU going into Phase 4. We started off with WandaVision, and I'm going to be honest, as a whole, the shows are painfully mediocre. I feel like there was so much potential here, and this is really what drags down the entirety of Phase 4. I think movies-wise, and I'll get into that specifically in just a second here, I think movies-wise, this might be one of, if not the best phase in the MCU, at least for me personally. And I know I have a lot of hot takes in terms of the movies themselves, in terms of what I like and what I dislike, because I feel like a lot of people like the same amount of movies as me. I just like the movies that I like a lot more, and I rank them way higher in the overall MCU. Like I said before, I think the shows are just painfully mediocre, except for WandaVision and Loki, and those two are the only ones that I've rewatched. If you guys want to check out my full Phase 4 ranking, I already made a full video on that. It includes all 15 movies and TV shows. I think the biggest downfall of the MCU on the show side is the format that they chose. They're doing 6 one-hour episodes or 9 30-minute episodes, and these episodes aren't even a full 1 hour. If they are an hour, they're like 45 minutes, and a lot of times they were even 40 minutes with like 5 to 10 minutes of credits, which really was just annoying. It really just felt like we were just grabbing for content every week. It didn't feel like they were giving us anything actually tangible, and I will say shows like Loki and WandaVision, I feel like they solved some of those problems, even though they were the earlier shows. I think WandaVision was obviously the first one, and Loki was the third one, if I'm not mistaken. But throughout all of the shows, I just feel like, again, they were just very mediocre. There was such high potential. I think one that really worked best in and of itself was She-Hulk. I think it knew what it was trying to be, and it really focused on that. It didn't try to do way too much. Luckily, it does seem like they're moving away from that, but obviously that's not going to be in this phase. Echo is, I'm pretty sure, the last show that's going to be 6 to 9 episodes long, and Daredevil Born Again is going to be 18 episodes, and they're rumored to be like 40 minutes to an hour long each, which is absolutely insane. But to kind of wrap up this TV section, I definitely think this is the downfall of Phase 4. I mean, quality-wise, which again, I'll talk about like the overload of content here, because that's the main thing to talk about when it comes to Phase 4. I think the TV shows, again, are really the downfall. It feels like they were just doing too much here. If you guys didn't know, I think by the time Miss Marvel was coming out, this Phase 4 had more hours of content than every other phase combined. And again, it's just because each show is like minimum 6 hours long, which is insane to think about. But you can also see that in the production, which again, we'll touch on in just a second. But I quickly want to touch over the movies. Like I said before, I really do like the movies in this phase, and the highs are very high. I think my top like 5 movies of this phase are top 15 MCU. And there are 30 movies total, which means that they make up a good chunk of the top half of the MCU, in my opinion. And the only like straight up bad movie, in my opinion, in this phase is Thor: Love and Thunder, which I just hate to even talk about, so I won't spend too much time on that. But I will say the only mediocre movie here is Black Widow. I still think movies like Eternals, Shang-Chi, I think those are great movies. And again, at the end of this video, I'll be ranking all the phases, and I'm going to be going through each of the movies and TV shows. I color coordinated it, made a little bit of a graphic to go off of and compare all the stuff to you guys. So again, stay tuned to the end of the video for that. But again, the rest are pretty much good and up from Black Widow. I mean, you have Shang-Chi, Eternals, Wakanda Forever, No Way Home, and Multiverse of Madness. These movies are all good to great to phenomenal. Multiverse of Madness and No Way Home are in my top 5 MCU movies. I absolutely adore these. Multiverse of Madness is in my top 3, if I'm not mistaken. The highs of this phase are super, super high. And again, strictly movie-wise, the MCU was really doing great here. I definitely think there were some content issues, which is the next thing I want to talk about, is just they're pushing out way too much content in this phase. This was a huge problem for Phase 4, but I don't see this stopping for phases 5, 6, however long in the future we're going. I don't see this stopping, because if we look at that future slate, and I'll talk about just the implications of Phase 4 on the future again later in this video, but I definitely think just the pace that Marvel is trying to expand at, that is definitely going to require them to do a lot of work at once, and it requires them to push out a lot of CG, and a lot of times it doesn't look that great. And Multiverse of Madness and Love and Thunder are huge examples to that, in my opinion. Multiverse of Madness is like top 3 MCU movies for me, but at the same time, there are moments in which the CG is unbearable. For example, the part, I think it's on Titan, where they kill Thanos, the Illuminati kills Thanos, and then they kill that other alternate version of Strange. Those moments, the CGI is so bad, it's difficult to look at. And even in Thor Love and Thunder, they use the dome, like the 3-dimensional virtual reality screen. They use it in movies like The Batman and shows like The Mandalorian, and it looks 100 times better because they're just rushing it here. They don't know how to use it. They don't properly know how to implement it into their movie. They're like, oh, it works. We're going to do it super fast. It'll save us time so we can push out more content. That really sucks. And it feels like they really spread this phase very, very thin. Again, I know I'm saying I love this phase, but there are inherent issues here, and it's mainly based around the amount of content they're making. I definitely think the highs, though, are very high, and that does have to do with story as well, and the themes that they chose to interweave throughout this entire phase, which I'll talk about just a second, the themes of grief and loss that they're consistently going back to here. But even story-wise, there's a lot of inconsistencies. For example, Spider-Man No Way Home, they were rewriting this movie as it was coming out. Even Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness, the Illuminati was added in like 3/4 of their way done making this movie. They're adding stuff in because they're so indecisive with their story, because they have so much going on and they're spreading their content so thin. It's just not feasible to keep going at this rate, but they're going to keep pushing all of this content out. And I don't think this is going to be just a phase 4 issue. People are saying, oh, it's just phase 4. It's just no, I think phase 5, phase 6, I think these problems are going to keep on happening. And I really don't see another alternative to this other than tone down the amount of projects you had. They already delayed the 2 Avengers movies, Kang Dynasty and Secret Wars. They already moved, like both of them, they were going to come out within 365 days of each other. And so I'm happy, yes, they're spending more time on it, but it's still an absurd amount of content that they're making. And again, I don't see them fixing this too much content issue unless they start spreading their projects out more. Like I mentioned before, there's this underlying theme of grief throughout this entire phase, and that's why it's one of my favorite phases. If you look at all of these different Marvel projects and TV shows, movies, whatever you want to talk about, every single one of these has an underlying theme of grief, in my opinion, and that also is to go in like hand in hand with passing the mantle. And that's really what this phase is. This phase, in my opinion, is really encapsulated by what Wakanda Forever does, and that is that overall theme of loss and moving on. I think after Avengers Endgame, you have this big culmination, and in the moment of watching Avengers Endgame, you're like, how can they top this? The only way to do that is to go multiversal instead of universal. And I'm going to talk more about like the future and just building off of our past stories in just a second here. But keeping on the theme of grief and loss and passing the mantles, you have characters like Hawkeye passing the mantle to Kate, Black Widow to Yelena, Steve to Sam, T'Challa to Shuri, and even Strange to America Chavez. But that one was definitely more of an internal thing. But nevertheless, you have these really, really big changes within the MCU. You're switching out your main characters. There is a lot of shifting going on here, and it's not something that happens slow, which I do think is a mistake that Marvel made. But at the same time, they lost a year of what they could do here with COVID. I'm pretty sure the Marvel slate was completely different. I also do have a hunch that they were going to make Chadwick Boseman's T'Challa the future of the MCU, but obviously he unfortunately passed away, and they couldn't go through with that, and it seems like that also threw them for a whirlwind. And that's my main thing with the future of the MCU, which again, I don't want to get too sidetracked, so I'm going to talk about that in just a second, but it seems like they're still searching for who is that main person, who is going to lead the future of the MCU. Circling back to the themes for just a second here, I mean, I think Multiverse of Madness also encapsulates everything pretty well with that message of you can't control everything, it's really fate. And that's kind of what this message of the rebuilding phase in the MCU is you're introducing new characters. You don't know where they're going to lie in the MCU. You don't know what their connection is. You have characters like Moon Knight, She-Hulk, Miss Marvel. And of course, these characters are so spread out. They're not related to each other like at all, but they're all going to play their part eventually. And I think Disney Plus does this really cool thing where you can have these individual stories, you can have these individual characters that don't really need to be connected to anything, but you can still tell their stories of their loss and their grief. And these characters that, though they aren't connected to the overall Marvel universe, like Moon Knight has no relation to the multiverse, but it's still such a personal and such a heartbreaking story that fits in the themes of this entire phase. I think why a lot of people don't like Phase 4 of the MCU is because of how jarring of a switch it is from like Endgame and Far From Home to just starting over, especially WandaVision being the first project back. You have so much unknownness happening. Like there is just no direction in the MCU. And I made a full video on talking about why I think there's 100% of direction. And this video came out before the Comic-Con, the San Diego Comic-Con announcements that they had. I was one that believed that the MCU has had direction for the longest time. People just needed it out on a slate to actually understand. But I want to talk about just building off of the past here, because the first 10 years of the MCU, it was one straight story. To get something bigger than what we had in Avengers Infinity War and Endgame, to get bigger than Thanos, you have to build more. You have to expand your universe even more. There were only a few projects in the Infinity Saga that weren't really building off of each other. They weren't really going hand in hand. Like, for example, Captain America: The Winter Soldier. There was no like universal threat in that, but we're not even at a universal threat anymore. We're at a multiversal threat. You have to build so much now. You have to just expand your universe as much as possible, whether it is those random grounded shows like She-Hulk, Miss Marvel, even Moon Knight, or you have those huge movie events like Multiverse of Madness. You have all these other upcoming movies coming out that are just building and expanding teams that aren't necessarily connected one-on-one to each other. I just don't really think that's a priority for the MCU right now, because they're just trying to expand and get as far out as possible. It's not one continuing story at this point, and I personally really like that. And the final thing to talk about before we start ranking the phases here is just the future of the MCU and why I think Phase 4 sets it up perfectly. We're not going up against a universal threat anymore. We're going up against a multiversal threat, and that means you need a lot more characters to expand your universe, and the entire upcoming slate looks absolutely amazing to me. I definitely feel like in the first 10 years, whether you want to admit it or not, there was a lot of replicated themes. A lot of the stuff was just a basic formula that was followed, and one main thing with that is the villains, and I think that within the MCU's Phase 4, villains are something that were really unique. I mean, none of them felt like copycat villains, really. They felt like they all had really cool and intriguing motives. They all had very unique skill and power sets. All of these villains felt like they were directed differently than one another, whereas in the first 10 years of the MCU, a lot of times if you were a supervillain, you just had the same power set as your superhero. And I know it's a complaint that a lot of people have had, but especially in comparison to Phase 4, that's something that Phase 4 does much better, and I'm excited for that going into the future of the MCU, because Phase 4 has allowed for so much creative difference rather than the first 10 years that it's like, I really wish they were doing this before in the MCU, but they couldn't, because it was one streamlined story. It was one streamlined group of characters. Here, you're spreading it out so much that it doesn't matter what you do for one movie, because the next movie can be completely creatively different. To end off this video, I'm going to go ahead and rank all 4 phases of the MCU. So just so you guys know, on the graphic, red means that the movie is just straight up bad. Probably would never rewatch it unless I had to. Purple is a movie that I wouldn't mind rewatching. You know, it's just a good movie. It's just a classic MCU. You know, it's average. But green is something that is absolutely great or phenomenal or just top tier MCU, or just something that I really enjoy, whether it's a good film or not. But starting it off in 4th place for me is Phase 1. As you guys can see, the Avengers, Iron Man are my good, great green movies, and then we have as my purple Iron Man 2, Thor, and the first Avenger as my good movies, and then in red is Incredible Hulk. I think this is a good introductory phase. It does a lot of the same stuff that Phase 4 does in terms of just being like a regular, not that cohesive phase until the very end, and even then Phase 4 is more interlinked by the thematic elements rather than Phase 1 just being a bunch of random movies. I will say on a filmmaking level though, everything in Phase 1 is very well made. It's probably the best made movies in the entire MCU. I absolutely love the production quality of Phase 1. Next up in places 3 and 2, these are very close to me, and I do think 3rd place will overtake 2nd place as time goes on and I get to watch these movies more and more. But in 3rd place for me is Phase 4. So my great and phenomenal movies, the greens, include Multiverse of Madness, Shang-Chi, Eternals, No Way Home, and the shows include WandaVision and Loki. And then the good average movies include Black Widow, and the shows are Falcon Winter Soldier, Moon Knight, Miss Marvel, and She-Hulk. For the bad projects, Love and Thunder, What If, and Hawkeye, those are just genuinely projects that I never want to rewatch. I'll probably rewatch Hawkeye during the holiday season to see if I was wrong, but I doubt I was wrong about my thoughts on it. And since it says an MCU Phase 4 centric movie, I want to show you guys that these main 5 movies that I really like in Phase 4 are all in my top 15 MCU. Eternals is in 14th place, right above the original Iron Man. Shang-Chi is right above Ant-Man in 11th place. Wakanda Forever is right above Doctor Strange in 10th place. And in my top 5 are Spider-Man No Way Home at 4th and Multiverse of Madness as my second favorite MCU movie. I will say though, in contrast, Thor Love and Thunder is my second least favorite MCU movie, sitting at 28th place. And Black Widow is one of just the average movies that's in 23rd place. But the fact that Thor Love and Thunder is that low shows that the lows of this phase are very, very low. Now, I will say really quickly, I did forget to put Werewolf by Night on this Phase 4 graphic. If you guys checked out my Phase 4 ranked video, it's like one of my favorite projects in the entirety of Phase 4. I think it's in 4th place. And again, if you want to check out that Phase 4 ranked video, it'll be linked in the description down below. But even that, I don't really know how to compare to movies, so I don't put it on the MCU ranking list. But even that is a phenomenal project. That would be a green for me. But the main thing that limits Phase 4 for me is the shows. And it's not that they're all even bad. Like I said before, there's only 2 really bad shows. And honestly, the rest are just pretty mediocre other than WandaVision and Loki. Falcon Winter Soldier, Moon Knight, Miss Marvel, and She-Hulk. The thing is, they all had such high potential. They had such a high potential of being amazing shows. They all had great concepts, but the execution of this 6 or 9 episode format just was not it. They undermined every possibility of these shows being absolutely phenomenal. I mean, I think Miss Marvel was a show that handled it best, and I also think She-Hulk did a good enough job with it. But shows like Loki and WandaVision, they're not even comparable because they're much better than these mediocre shows. But the fact that you have these 4 very mediocre projects within the amount of projects that they actually had is very disappointing. And at the end of the day, Phase 4 is just heavily limited by the shows, in my opinion. That's why it can't surpass the second place. And in second place for me is Phase 2. The greens I have for Phase 2 are the Winter Soldier, Guardians of the Galaxy, and Ant-Man. The purples are Iron Man 3, Age of Ultron, and then the red is Thor Dark World. Thor Dark World is my least favorite MCU movie, which really does drag the phase down in general, but also the Winter Soldier is top 5 MCU for me. Guardians of the Galaxy is phenomenal, and Ant-Man is one of the most underrated movies in the entire MCU. And this is where I get a little bit conflicted because the average movies like Iron Man 3 and Age of Ultron, though they're lower on the MCU list, I still don't think they're that bad compared to the very low lows of Phase 4. The more I look at this list, I actually think Phase 4 might be better, but I'm going to keep Phase 2 just above because the Winter Soldier and Guardians of the Galaxy are some of the best superhero movies of all time. But again, looking back at Phase 4, just comparing it to Phase 2, I just really don't know what to think. I also think I might be a little bit biased because Phase 4 is very new and I'm really into these movies. I just really don't know what to think in terms of comparing these two. But again, Phase 2, in my opinion, it's a really great phase. I just don't know how to compare these shows to movies, what I'm comparing it in terms of just the amount of hours of content there is, how much of an impact the content had on the bigger MCU. I just don't really know how to compare Phase 4 to the rest of these because it's just so different and unique in my opinion. But moving on to first place, I think this is a pretty universal choice. Phase 3 is easily the best phase of the MCU, and I really don't ever see them topping it. The 2 worst movies are Captain Marvel and Far From Home, and though they aren't that good of movies anyway, I wouldn't even say they're like complete garbage like Thor Love and Thunder or Thor Dark World. Even the baseline good movies like Endgame, Ant-Man and the Wasp, and Black Panther, they are actually movies that I would turn on any day of the week. And then when you get to the great and phenomenal movies in this phase, they are just stellar. You have Civil War, Doctor Strange, Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2, Spider-Man Homecoming, and Thor Ragnarok. These are some of the best pieces of content the MCU has ever produced. I don't know how they're ever going to top Phase 3. I'm just now realizing this. I forgot to put Infinity War on this graphic, and I'm somehow missing my favorite movie in the entire MCU. Infinity War is the best MCU movie by a mile. I don't see any movie topping this one in the near future. Quantumania could because of my personal excitement for it and my personal love for Ant-Man as well as my personal hype for Kang. But really, I don't see any MCU movie topping this. Just how jarring that movie was, the way it ended is something you never expect from the MCU. I could see Kang Dynasty or Secret Wars topping it in terms of just like what the heck happened to moments. But Avengers Infinity War is just perfectly crafted. And again, I don't know how I missed putting it on this graphic. But yeah, Phase 3 is easily the best phase of the MCU, and again, I don't really see any phase topping it in the near future. But guys, that's pretty much it for this video. Again, I just wanted to talk about Phase 4, all of my thoughts on Phase 4, because I love it more than the average person. I think it's actually a really great phase, and the more I think about it, it might be better than Phase 2, but I'm gonna let it sit on my mind for a little bit. Like I said earlier, let me know all of your thoughts on Phase 4, whether you liked it or disliked it. I love to hear everyone's thoughts on it in the comments down below. Thanks so much for watching. I'll see you next time. Peace.